I get a print version of the local newspaper, the Washington Post, delivered every Sunday. And so I woke up yesterday morning to the headline, Gauntlet awaits for U.S. Speaker. And then with the subheadings, staying power to be put to the test, shut down far right flank, place McCarthy in pincer. Interestingly, the headline for the online version was quite different. It said, Speaker McCarthy steps into the breach as his conference toils, with the subheading, the next 2 weeks will put the California Republican to the test of whether he can unite Republican lawmakers and avert a government shutdown. So there's a few idioms to look at there, but the thing that struck me yesterday morning was that word gauntlet, because it was spelled Gantlet, and maybe it was just the typeface of gauntlet and its prominence or position on the page or something, but it looked really odd to me, like something was off. And I thought maybe it's because it should have been spelled with a U, Gauntlet. And I even had to Google it to make sure that the venerable Post hadn't somehow messed up its front page headline. And so that led to reading about the difference between gauntlet with a U and gauntlet without one. And I thought that this could be a springboard for another episode of Idiom America. So welcome to this second episode of Season 3. And let's start by looking at that idiom in the print headline, to have the gauntlet await, which refers, of course, to the idiom run the gauntlet. So what is a gauntlet without a U? Well, as you probably know, it's a form of punishment in which people armed with sticks or other weapons arrange themselves into two lines and they beat a person that's forced to run between them. So it's an outdated form of punishment, to be sure, but I wouldn't put it past some of these current Congress critters to subject Kevin McCarthy to it in its non-idiomatic literal sense, just so that they could post it on Twitter or X, I guess, for the entertainment value and the likes. But the word gauntlet comes from Sweden, and it was borrowed into English in the 17th century, probably from English and Swedish soldiers who were fighting in the Protestant armies during the 30 Years' War, which was from 1618 to 1648. And the gauntlet continued to be used sporadically as a military punishment in the Swedish army until it was abolished in 1851. And it was also used as a civilian punishment for certain crimes in Sweden until the 18th century. But Sweden wasn't the only one that used it. Germany, Austria, Russia also used it to punish soldiers until the 19th century. A number of Native American tribes, particularly in the eastern woodlands early on, we're talking 1600s, forced their prisoners to run the gauntlet too. And there were all kinds of variations. In the British Royal Navy, they would use runs of the gauntlet where shipmates would strike the offender with cat-o'-nine tails. And in Germany, sometimes it would be more of a walk than a run, and there would be somebody that would walk ahead of the offender with a blade to prevent him from running. And the spelling of this kind of gauntlet is also acceptable with a U. That's the American usage guides like Brian Garner say that gauntlet without a U is preferred in order to avoid confusion with the other kind of gauntlet, the kind you throw down or take up, that we'll talk about here later. But I guess the Washington Post editors follow this guidance, but gauntlet without a U is strictly an American usage, according to most British dictionaries. And I actually prefer gauntlet with a U. It just looks better to me. Maybe because I see the other gauntlet, the one with the U, more often. Maybe because it ties in the word gaunt. Maybe because gauntlet without the U looks like it should be pronounced gantlet. I don't know. But I think the people agree with me that it should have a U, or at least the Wikipedians, because they spell the title of the article about this as running the gauntlet with a U. Either way, running the gauntlet shouldn't be confused, obviously, with running the gamut, which is another idiom, which in this case means to experience the entire range of something, the full scope. as in the spellings of gauntlet, run the gamut from gantlet with the U to, or from gauntlet with the U to gauntlet without a U. That's why I don't like gauntlet without a U. Or, another example, we had a good talk. It ran the gamut from philosophy to gardening. But what's a gamut? This one I didn't know, and so I was interested to find out that gamut traces its origin to a system from the Middle Ages for designating musical notes. Around the turn of the second millennium, Guido of Arezzo, a medieval monk, developed a system of solmization, which is designating musical notes by syllable names. And so while today we're familiar with do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, back in Guido's time, and he died back in 1050, they had a hexatonic scale of 6 notes, and he used the syllables ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la. And the ut, ut, represented the lowest tone recognized in music theory at the time, and it was the second G below middle C, which was also known as gamma. And today, you can see this note, which remains as the lowest line of the bass clef. And Guido chose ut from the hymn Ut Ciant Laxus Resonare, which was sung in honor of St. John the Baptist. And so he contracted together the name of the note gamma with its sung syllable ut, and in that way Guido coined the word gamut, which he used to identify his system of solmization. And building on this, gamut eventually came to mean the whole musical scale in the 1620s and a range of notes of a voice or instrument by the 1630s, and nowadays it just means the whole range or scale. And if you're like me, the original scale has been forgotten. Before we move on to the second type of gauntlet, let's look at the idiom from the online version of the article in the Post. It said, Speaker McCarthy steps into the breach as his conference toils. And step into the breach, of course, means to take up a task that has been abandoned by another, to take on a vital responsibility when others have not, to do someone's work when they're suddenly not able to do it. And this idiom resonates most in the military context, with the breach being a gap in the wall or a line of defense through which the enemy may enter, with the idea being that the person who steps into the breach puts himself between the item he is defending and disaster. And you also hear this one as next into the breach, and less frequently as once more into the breach, which has more of a connotation of to try again or to make one more attempt. And that latter phrasing comes from Shakespeare, which is where this idiom, like so many, ultimately originates. In his play Henry V from 1598, you had King Henry V encouraging his troops during the siege of the French seaport Harfleur in 1415. And the breach in question was a gap in the wall of the city of Harfleur, which the English army held under siege. And Henry was encouraging his troops to have courage and attack the city again. And so, as Shakespeare wrote, once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more, or close the wall up with their English dead. And if you like Shakespeare puns, you might get a chuckle out of the title of George Brandt's play about the actress versions of Rosie the Riveter called Into the Breaches. And that's breeches with 2 E's. And it's about women who had to step into men's breeches and take on the roles, the acting roles, Shakespearean roles that were once played by the men that were now fighting overseas during World War II. While we're on Shakespeare and breeches, it's also worth mentioning the phrase more honored in the breach than the observance, which refers to rules, customs, laws, etc. that are frequently broken in practice, with obedience being the exception. It's also sometimes used to lament that the tradition or custom is falling out of fashion. Something like how the good old tradition of fair play in some sport is more honored in the breach than in the observance, followed by a sorrowful shake of the head. And this comes from Hamlet, when he said, But to my mind, though I am native here, and to the manner born, it is a custom more honored in the breach than the observance. And we've kind of twisted the meaning of this phrase into the opposite of what Hamlet meant, as Hamlet meant it in this context that this was a custom that would literally be better honored by breaking it in that circumstance than by adhering to it. All right, let's look at that other gauntlet, the one that you throw down or take up. The word itself comes from the French word gauntlet, and it refers to the heavy armored gloves that were worn by medieval knights. And back when chivalry and personal honor were paramount, throwing a gauntlet at the feet of an enemy was considered a grave insult that could only be answered with personal combat, and the offended party was expected to take up the gauntlet to acknowledge and accept the challenge. And over time, as heavy steel armor became less common, gauntlets referred to any heavy glove with an extended cuff to protect the wrist. And the practice of using gloves to initiate duels continued until dueling was outlawed in Europe and the U.S. in the late 18th century. And one variation on this was to just not throw down the glove, but to take it off and slap someone in the face with it, which was even more of an insult to one's honor. And to throw down the gauntlet means, of course, to invite someone to fight or compete with you, to challenge someone. And to take up the gauntlet means to accept the challenge, to show that you're willing and ready to fight, argue, or compete with someone. And another idiom that involves gloves and fighting is to take off the gloves or drop the gloves or gloves are off. And this, of course, means that people are about to start behaving in a more hostile or tenacious way, usually used to describe a dispute or fight. The president is apparently waiting until after the convention to take off the gloves and really begin the campaign. And this could tie into the history of throwing down the gauntlet and dueling, although it also evokes the image of a boxer removing his boxing gloves and fighting bare-knuckled to inflict more damage, so it probably has more to do with that. There is an earlier variant of the idiom, though, to handle someone without gloves, which was used since the early 1800s and was still in use during the early 1900s, and it had much the same meaning. To handle a person without gloves was to deal with them in a rough and uncompromising way. And then think of the idiom to treat someone with kid gloves that we looked at last season in the context of Kid Glove Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd President of the United States. Finally, there's the idiom rule with a velvet glove, meaning to rule, govern, or control a group or population in a very permissive, lenient, or flexible manner. And this one's also heard as having an iron fist and a velvet glove, signifying that firmness can be couched in outward gentleness. And Napoleon Bonaparte is often credited with having first used this expression, at least according to the Dictionary of Clichés. All right, well, this episode has run the gamut from gauntlets to breeches to gauntlets with a U to gloves, and it's probably run its course as well. Thanks for listening.